Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs Dean's Leadership Series. I am Amani Jamal, and I am the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm so happy to see all of you here this afternoon and this evening. One of Princeton SPIA's strategic priorities is policy influence. The results of this year's elections will have profound policy implications for many years to come. As the country's premier public policy school, we have a responsibility to understand what happened and reflect on how it will impact our work and that of our students. In addition to learning from our own expert faculty, we have the privilege of welcoming informed speakers from all over the world to provide information and context. Our guest today is uniquely qualified to offer an analysis of November 5th elections and its impact on the political landscape. Amy Walter is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. For more than 25 years, she has built a reputation for accurate, objective, and insightful political analysis with unparalleled access to campaign insiders and decision makers. A contributor to PBS NewsHour, Amy provides weekly political analysis for its popular Politics Monday segment and is a featured contributor for its election and convention special coverage events. She's also a regular Sunday panelist on NBC's Meet the Press and CNN's Inside Politics, and appears frequently on Special Report with Brett Baer on Fox News Channel. My thanks to Amy for joining us this afternoon. And also, we want to welcome Catherine Ham, one of our very own Princeton alum as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I thank all of you for being with us today for what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion with our very own Frances Lee, Professor of Politics and Public Affairs. She will speak following Amy's remarks. I also want to thank Frances and Tali Mendelberg for co-directing our Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, which just has done amazing work on the elections and following the elections, and there are more events to come. So thank you for that as well. Before I turn things over to her, I want to remind you all that SPIA is a place of constructive dialogue and civil conversations. There are some tips on the screen above, but they will serve as guidelines for our constructive dialogue. And with that, thank you again. And I will now turn it over to Amy Walter.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean. And this is pretty cool. I'm a professor at Princeton. I didn't even go and get a graduate degree. So this is pretty fantastic. This feels like I'm speaking to quite an august audience. And as the Dean rightly noted, I am here, one, because this was such an honor for me to be invited to have this conversation, talk about this election, and to share insights and to learn from you all. But also, when you're married to a Princetonian and Princeton asks you to do something, of course you say yes. There is no choice. Of course you have to come in. And the good news is I don't need to march in a parade. So this is a lot easier than that, and a lot more comfortable. Anyway, I thought I would just do a very, very brief sort of 30,000-foot view of the election, and then we're going to spend our time doing a moderated conversation, and then, of course, opening it up for questions and comments. You know, the fascinating thing about this election, and I guess it's like many elections where you can sort of peel it like an onion. You can see at each layer a little something more. At its most basic, this election is the kind of thing that if you're a political science student, you could have basically predicted before this election even began, which is we know that, especially when it comes to presidential campaigns, an unpopular president rarely gets reelected. In fact, this president came into the 2024 election with one of the lowest job approval ratings that we've seen in recent era. He came into the election with a job approval rating somewhere around 40%. So even lower than where Donald Trump was in 2020, certainly lower than where we had seen our previous presidents like Obama running for re-election or George W. Bush running for re-election. So we know that number is important. We know, again, at a most basic level, that Americans were frustrated with the status quo. They thought, at least 2/3 of Americans thinking the country is off on the wrong track, that the economy's in a bad place. And more important, they saw the challenger candidate in Donald Trump, even though he was not a challenger in the traditional sense because he had been an incumbent. So it was this odd thing of having two incumbents running against each other, both trying to be the change candidate and the turn the page candidate. What he benefited from was the fact that while he wasn't any more popular personally in 2024 than he was in 2020, what he did have going for him was that the retrospective vision, or really in retrospect, his job approval was much higher than at any time when he was president. So as people were looking and thinking back to, oh, what was it like 4 years ago? They weren't looking through the prism of, remember who Donald Trump is personally, as much as they were remembering what it was like, at least for certain policies like the economy. And very simply, I had more money in my pocket then, or I felt more comfortable about the state of the economy than I feel more, or the economy feels shakier. I feel more stressed about it now than I did back then. And on other issues too, like the border or what is happening overseas, giving him more credit on those issues, even than when he was president. In fact, if you look at the last polls taken, the national polls taken that asked the job approval rating, the retrospective job approval rating of Donald Trump, all of those polls showed his approval rating over 50%. Donald Trump was the only president in modern history who, when he was president, never hit 50% job approval rating. The NBC poll that came out, I think it was the week before the election, had his approval rating higher than at any point since they asked the question about Donald Trump. So that, again, people are upset about the economy. They're upset about the incumbent. They see the challenger, who was once the incumbent, was doing a good job on the things that they're most stressed about. At its most basic level, that's what this election was about. And it's not really surprising to see the result. But then you peel it back a little bit more and you say, okay, so this is also the third straight presidential election where the incumbent party has lost, right? 2016, it was a Democratic administration. Hillary Clinton loses. Obviously, 2020, Trump loses. And now, in this case, Biden loses. We haven't seen anything like that since, well, the last time an incumbent president tried to get his job back in the 1890s, that we had 3 consecutive losses from the incumbent party for president. And if we look just since 2006, every election has been a change election. Every election has been a rejection of the status quo, whether the status quo was a D or an R, whether it was Republicans in Congress or Democrats in Congress, a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House. When I first started in politics in Washington was in the early 90s. And back then, Democrats had uncontested control of the House. They had unbroken streak of control of Congress for 40 years. 1994, Republicans win control of Congress. They hold Congress through 2006 when Democrats take the majority. Since 2006, the House has flipped 4 times. The Senate has flipped 4 times. Change is now normal. And this is actually just a continuation, seemingly, of this trend of either voters are just really unhappy all the time, and who's ever in charge gets a penalty because who's ever in charge isn't fixing the things that people want them to fix. It's also, I think, part of our, what else has happened since 2006? Well, we had the iPhone that came out in 2006, the explosion of things like social media since that time. So those things contributing to it. And we are a much more polarized country in terms, as one political professor calls it, the calcification actually of our polarization is so intensive that no matter who you are, once you come into office, you know that 48% of people in the country already hate you. Right? There's no honeymoon. I remember there used to be these honeymoons for presidents. They would come in and voters would say, well, I didn't vote for the guy, but let's give him a chance. And then they would eventually go back to their partisanship. Now you're lucky to get like a weekend at Niagara Falls kind of honeymoon. There's no such thing. So it's really, how do you build just thinking through this, especially for those of you who are going into policy or politics, how do you build change, or how do you make change or fix broken things if you only have a 2-year window, which, as we all know, is really like a 6-month window, right? Before you have to start getting back on the campaign trail or thinking about the next election. And then if you peel it back just one more layer, and this I think we'll be talking about a lot today, is really the other fundamental thing that changed in this election, which is the makeup of the two parties' coalitions. That both candidates were making a bet, and which is really what campaigns are, right? You have a theory of the case, and you kind of have to go with that theory. The Trump bet was that they could build a coalition that was more diverse and was younger and was more expansive than the one that brought him to the White House in 2016, and that a coalition that was more successful than the one that obviously he did not win with in 2020. Now, if you look at, for example, the way he won the White House in 2016, how was it? What did we talk about? Almost ad nauseum after 2016. White working class voters. Everybody in politics, everybody who covered politics had to go to a diner somewhere in the middle of the country to talk to a white guy with a trucker hat on to talk about what happened. How did Donald Trump do this? But what we learned in 2020 is that he basically maxed that out. Even as he turned out more of those types of voters, the coalition of Biden voters who were more diverse, were younger, more female, and Biden also did better among men, that coalition is bigger than the Trump coalition. So the Trump coalition's bet was, we can pick off people that don't traditionally vote for Republicans and also don't always come out and vote. They're hard to get as committed voters, in part because they are so distrustful of the system. They're so cynical of the process. And so they made a bet that they could pick off these younger men, especially men of color, and bring them into the fold, even though it was kind of a risky bet. Democrats have been running up the score with voters of color, with younger voters, since the Obama era. Democrats have won 60% of the under 30-year-old vote. That obviously didn't happen this time. So the bet that they made paid off. The bet that the Harris campaign was making is that they could lose elements of that so-called Obama coalition, but they could make up with it by having a record turnout among women, or doing better with these so-called Nikki Haley or Liz Cheney voters, right? Finding those disaffected Republicans who are voters, who do show up and vote consistently. So they didn't have to worry about, will they show up or not? Really, all they had to do was find them, energize them, and ensure that they pulled the lever for Harris. But at the end of the day, there aren't enough of those voters to make up for the coalition of folks who showed up for Donald Trump. And so what we have here now, and this is really the conversation going forward, is the two parties now really being divided, not just on who's at the top of the ticket, but who their voters are. for the longest time, certainly since I've been covering politics, Democrats did best with the voters who weren't always the most reliable of voters because they were younger, because they are not at the higher, they don't have a higher level of education. They're not at the same level of personal finance. So those voters tend to turn out in presidential years, don't tend to turn out in off years or in not high profile elections. Now, Republicans do best with those voters. Who do Democrats do best with? Older, whiter, higher educated, wealthier voters. We used to call them Republicans. We now call them Democrats. And it's Democrats who seem to be caught in the place where Republicans were for a long time, which is sort of a demographic cul-de-sac that they are still winning. Democrats are still winning a majority of Latino voters, of Asian American voters, of African American voters, and of younger voters, but not by the margins that they need to in order to have a winning coalition, not just at the electoral college level, but also at the popular vote level. And so the question going forward is this a new enduring shift? That is the Republican Party now the populist, multi-ethnic, multiracial party of the anti-elite, of the anti-establishment, and the Democratic Party is now the defender, the avatar for institutionalism and for institutional places like this and traditional, what we think of as traditional government and other traditional aspects of our lives, how that is going to work out for these next, not just 4 years, but for a long time coming. It's going to be, I think, fascinating for all of us to dig through. So I will leave it at that so we can talk about it some more. Thank you so much. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Jamal, for organizing this great opportunity to dissect what happened in the 2024 elections. And thank you very much for being here, Amy. Before this event, Amy took the time to meet with my students in domestic politics class, and so it's just really great to have you here and to get the benefit of your insights. I wanted to start with a personal question for you. Whether at first I wanted to frame it as just whether you were surprised by the outcome of the election. But I take from your remarks that you're really not.
Right.
So what I would ask you then is, would you have been surprised if Kamala Harris had won?
That is an excellent question. And I probably would have been, that would have been a bigger surprise would have been not just that she won, but if she swept in the way that Donald Trump did. In part because I think as we were watching this election, it seemed to go like this. You had Biden. Let's just start. I'm not going to go all the way back, but let's just start with the debate, right? We go into that debate and the immediate aftermath of that debate, and you see where the polling was going there. And it's not just that opinions of Biden soured. It's that the base itself, Democratic voters, were basically checking out. And you could hear it and see it and feel it. Democratic office holders, even from some of the bluest parts of the country, calling for Biden to step down. Why? Because they saw him dragging them down. And so at the conventions, the Co-Political Report did a series of interviews with the University of Chicago and their Institute of Politics. And we interviewed a couple of the people who do the super PAC it was for Biden, but then those super PAC folks moved over, obviously, to Harris. And they said that their modeling in July of Biden's chances was in the single digits of being, like, could we win? I mean, if does 5%, 5% does happen, but like, I wouldn't make that bet. Right? So what Harris did by getting into this race, she turned it from 5% basically to 50%, which is nothing to sneeze at. And in fact, her trajectory was really quite unprecedented to go from somebody who was just as unpopular as Biden was when she became the de facto nominee. Her favorable, unfavorable ratings were the exact same as his. 2 weeks later, she's 15 points more popular than he is. And in fact, even if you look at the exit polls, she still came into the election more popular, which is quite remarkable. You think she's the vice president, she should carry all that baggage. So her ability to sort of transcend that was really quite something. Her ability to unify the party as quickly as she did, also unprecedented. Certainly plenty of Democrats didn't think that was going to happen, and Republicans were hoping that wasn't going to happen. So that helped. And then because she was so new and it was so different, it was so unexpected, she also sort of captured the imagination of people that went beyond just the Democratic base. And so her numbers really did get her to a place where you could see a pathway for her to succeed. And then she had the debate, which was a very strong debate performance. And the Trump campaign still seemed unable to figure out how they were going to manage this, their messaging against her. But once they did, by the time we hit October, she really had plateaued, and then Trump started to move up a point or two. Again, not big movements, but enough. And so her path was always that either one, the polling was really overestimating Trump, which it hadn't done in the previous elections, or that ultimately this gamble that Trump was making on lower propensity voters was not going to pay off, and she was going to win. Because I was saying this in the class today, when we looked at, we worked with two really fantastic polling firms this year, did work in the battleground states. And when we looked at those voters who were the most consistent voters, people who showed up in the last 4 elections, they were telling us they were supporting Biden, Harris by 4 points. So even when Biden was at one of his lowest points, he was winning those voters. Harris was winning those voters in July. She was winning those voters in September. Who she wasn't winning over those people who were the less consistent voters. She was losing them by about 7 points. So you always then have to say, well, when it comes to turnout, it really was down to turnout. And so in that sense, it would have been that, wow, okay, even though all the fundamentals were against her, she was able to succeed because of his choice to make this campaign, not a campaign that tried to tack to the middle and win over swing voters, but because he's like, I'm going to go find more of my voters out there and take a risk that they'll show up.
There's been a lot of soul searching among Democrats since their defeat, focusing on whether the party had moved too far to the left on social issues, like immigration, policing, transgender rights. Is that your assessment? Do you think there's evidence that points to cultural issues as being a significant problem for Democrats in 2024?
I do think that there is a sense that the Democratic Party is looking out now for elites more than they're looking out for regular people. That is not universal, but if there's one thing that Democrats were known for, again, for as long as I've been involved in politics, is that they're the party of the little guy, and Republicans are the party for the big guy. The corporate sort of money, that you go to Republicans. If you want your sort of average working person, that's the Democratic Party. And I think this didn't happen overnight, this perception of Democrats as being more defenders of elite and elite institutions than for regular people. It wasn't just Donald Trump. We had started to see this shift away from Democrats by white working class voters, in the Obama era, certainly. And so, Bill Clinton was probably the last Democrat to win that group of voters. So it's not like, oh, it's just because of what happened in 2020 that shifted those voters away from Democrats. But our colleague Dave Wasserman this started to look at this question about culture through the lens of the eating establishments. So let me explain. So in 2000, I was talking to a Democrat who worked on the Gore campaign about what went wrong, and he said, we lost everywhere they didn't have a Starbucks. And I told that story, and we were talking about it in the office, and Charlie Cook, of course, the founder of the Cook Report, said, "Oh, that's so funny. I wonder what would be the analogous, like what would be the Republican place? If the Democrats are only winning Starbucks, what would it be for Republicans?" And we were like, well, maybe Walmart, right? And so it became this sort of like the Walmart versus Starbucks. But then as Starbucks and Walmart became sort of, they're now everywhere. Walmarts are in cities, Starbucks are, well, they're ubiquitous everywhere. Our colleague came up with two establishments that really define this divide in America between, you could sort of say blue and red, but also this idea of white and college and affluent and elite and lower income or blue collar white America. And it was Cracker Barrel and Whole Foods. And my favorite story that he tells about that was he was explaining this divide to a group of folks who, let's just say, at another elite institution. And a woman in the front said, "I'm sorry, did you say crate and barrels? I don't know what." Said, no. This is exactly what I'm talking. Like, you could not have set that up better. And so over time, what he's been mapping out is, the gap between the Democratic share or the Republican share in those counties that have just a Cracker Barrel or just a Whole Foods. Now, again, he's had to change it one more time because now Whole Foods are everywhere. And Cracker Barrels are starting to or suburbs are now going into rural areas. So it's now Lululemon and Tractor Supply. So he doesn't have his latest assessment, but what you saw from the Clinton era to now is the gap between how a Democrat performed in those just got wider and wider and wider. And, so you can't really blame it on just one, it's because Democrats in 2020 embraced transgender issues. That's why they lost. But there is definitely a sense of what Democrats stand for being there. I think, as I said, fundamentally, the economy was driving so much of the conversation, but there were also things that the administration did do or didn't do that fed into this idea that they weren't looking out for regular people or they didn't care about others. And I think that ad that the Trump campaign ran on the transgender issue, I'm sure because you guys get all the TV ads from Pennsylvania. So you saw, I'm sure many of them, where, it's Kamala Harris talking about her support for transgender, care of an illegal immigrant who is incarcerated, which basically summed up the argument perfectly, right? It wasn't just that it was about gender affirming care. It wasn't just somebody who's in prison. It's also someone who's here illegally, which just wrapped it all into what voters were already feeling, especially about the border. Why aren't they doing anything about this? Why are migrants getting bused to my area? And I think one of the more fascinating shifts that we saw in this election is Long Island, which during the Obama era and even the early Trump era was pretty blue, and certainly in the midterms, really, really blue. Boy, did it go really red this year. And I do think that the migrant piece of it was a big factor in that, because New York was obviously a place where so many had come to, and where so many cities were struggling to handle it.
One of the most striking shifts in the election was the way Trump improved his performance with demographics that have long been skeptical of Republicans. So younger voters, which you mentioned, urban voters, voters of color. I like this journalist Jesse Singal summed it up in a particularly apt way. He said, there's an easy way to understand the election. He said, one, pick a group that Democrats and their media supporters said would be turned off by Trump's remarks. And two, Trump made gains with this group. Democrats had long looked to the increasing diversity in the American electorate as a future advantage for the party. And they had seen the rising younger generation as more aligned with the Democratic Party than other generations.
Yep.
I'm interested in your assessment of the scope and significance of these shifts, most especially the shifts towards Trump among voters of color.
Yeah.
Do you see these shifts as signaling a realignment of the parties, with Republicans becoming more of a working class party with appeal across racial lines?
Yep.
And just more generally, which of these shifts do you see as important for party politics going forward? Which look to you to have potential for longer term effects on the party coalitions?
Yeah, great, really, really fascinating and great question. You know, I remember after the 2012 election and Romney's loss, Republicans were in the place that Democrats are now. A lot of hand wringing, a lot of, what? How can we keep losing? We keep putting the right candidates forward. We're putting these folks that are moderate, right? They're going to win the middle. John McCain, war hero. Mitt Romney, he's the businessman that America needs in the time of an economic crisis. Why do we keep losing? Obama was talking about, and Democrats were talking about this, to your point, what was called the coalition of the ascendant, that America was becoming more diverse every year, that the youngest generation was going to be the most diverse in history, and that as long as America kept diversifying and Republicans were only talking to white voters, Republicans would never, ever be able to win a national election ever again. And Republicans' answer to that was, they said, well, we got to do a better job reaching voters of color. Okay, yep, good. And younger people. Okay, how should we do this? We got to do something on immigration, right? And so you may remember this. This is when Marco Rubio and many of his colleagues said, we need to have a comprehensive immigration bill. That's how we're going to win Latino voters. And obviously, that did not succeed. It passed the Senate with a lot of Republican votes. But once it got to the House, and there was a backlash among Republican voters, especially in the conservative media ecosystem, it totally died on the vine. Before that, the way that Republicans said, here's how we can win over Latino voters. These are people who are driven by their faith. These are very family-oriented people. So we're going to talk about abortion. We're going to talk about that cultural issue. That didn't really work either. Where I think Trump has been able to be successful is that he's not using the obvious political policy moves, because he recognized people don't vote on policy. Sorry, policy people. They do. They like policy. It's important. Policy is important. But especially for younger voters, and actually for voters who are not engaged in thinking about, talking about, reading about our political system, the policy is not the issue. It is an idea that this person brings something, connects with me somehow. I see myself in what they're putting forward, right? It transcends policy. In the way Obama was able to transcend policy. What did he stand for? He was a Rorschach test for many folks. They looked at him and they saw what they wanted to see in him. And I think for Trump, it is this idea of a guy who's rich and successful, and he doesn't talk like a regular politician. He's not cowed by the traditional norms, and he's funny, and he's weird, and we kind of like that. And I've been saying to a number of folks that, one of the things that I think was my secret weapon in this election is our 17-year-old son, because I was able to see the world through his algorithm. And because how he gets information is how people get information in this, not just in this generation, but going forward. They aren't getting it through newspapers and TV in the way we know of that level of communication. They're getting it through not just the apps that they're following, but what I noticed was the people he was following, and they're mostly guys that are talking about video games and sports. Not a surprise. He wasn't going there looking for politics, but it came to find him because embedded within those conversations were conversations about Donald Trump. So it could start off as, oh my gosh, let's talk about, what is the game, Elden Ring or whatever, one of these games. And it would go into, oh my gosh, did you see the fight? Did you see that Donald Trump showed up at the UFC fight? Or, oh my gosh, Donald Trump was giving out French fries at McDonald's, right? We all laugh, haha, McDonald's, that's so silly. Seemed pretty normal. That's not something a politician does. There was this line about him, of alternative facts, or, an authentic liar. And there is that, like, voters are pretty smart. They're pretty savvy, and they know when they're being duped, and they know when they're being, sort of talked down to, or more important, that people are just, saying whatever they need to say politically to get their vote. And like, Trump doesn't hide that, right? He's just like, yeah, I'm just going to say what I want to say, and I'm going to do all this. He sort of took down the fourth wall, third wall, or whatever that's called, and sort of exposed the system. And for a generation, especially the younger generation, that is already so disillusioned and so cynical about the system, whatever we want to know is the system, that's a pretty appealing thing. What Kamala Harris was saying was, we do better when we're a community, when we work together. What he was selling is, you're a hustle guy. You win when you hustle, and you don't need all these other people telling you what to do. You don't need people here at Princeton telling you can't talk like that, you can't think like that, you have to use a pronoun, whatever it is. You just go out there and you do your thing. And this community, that's just kind of like, that's not where it is. And so at its very essence, her message of unity and coming together and bridging a divide, that's not the message that resonated with those voters. Now, where do they go from here becomes a really important question. George W. Bush got 40% of the Latino vote too in 2004. And then along came, 4 years later, comes Barack Obama. I think what we really need to think about, though, then is, especially with younger voters, is to appreciate the lack of identification they have with party, and to think about them more as swing voters than as base voters. And if you start at that place, and work backward, then you're going to build the coalition. So to think of these not as, oh, I just need to make sure I talk to them closer to election day because 70% of them are going to vote for me, thinking instead, maybe only 55 of them are going to vote for me. How can I make sure that I'm expanding that?
Now, it sounded like from your opening remarks that you saw the economy as the big obstacle in the way of Harris winning the election. And of course, if you looked at what economists were saying about the economy, and they pointed to low unemployment and strong growth and the decline of inflation back to baseline levels. And you sort of wonder, well, what are we missing here? What are we not understanding about how voters assess the economy, and why was it assessed so negatively in spite of the indicators that suggested the economy was doing reasonably well?
Yeah, right. And that we had come out of a pandemic, for crying out loud, right? That, by the time we hit 2022 and we had folks getting vaccinated and we were back to normal life, and but there was, of course, a lot of bumpiness on the way there, and couldn't people see that? Now, you can look around the world and say, well, every other developed country that had an election post-COVID has, the ruling party has suffered the same fate, right? And so this wasn't just unique to the US, but the post-COVID high inflation era created big problems for incumbent parties. And inflation is insidious, and that's why it's so much harder to solve than almost any other for a political incumbent party. Because, if you have high unemployment, you talk about, here are all the ways we're going to, reduce unemployment, get people back to work. But unemployment, maybe it hits you, but it doesn't hit the rest of this room. Inflation hits every single person in this room. Now, it may hit you differently, depending on what your income level is. But the fact that it was so high, so quickly, I think was really a punch in the gut for most Americans. It is something they hadn't felt. We haven't had inflation that high since the 70s, right? So if you are, a person under 50 or pretty much under 60, you've never lived at a time where you had to navigate this issue of inflation. And so this is where I think the disconnect and what the challenge of Biden's economic policy, never really sold, even though it was so popular. People loved the fact that we were building more bridges, loved the investment in the communities for the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, all these new big projects, employing a lot of people, shifting a lot of money into these regions of the country. But if you aren't able to fill up your grocery cart, or if you're worried that all the money that you saved for that one trip you wanted, now you got to spend instead on your day-to-day expenses, opening a new chips plant in the community is not going to make you feel all that better. So, we're going to have a lot of conversation in terms of soul searching. I think there's also going to be a lot of soul searching on the part of Democrats about communicating in this fractured media environment, and where, Trump was on all of these, right, we talk about the podcasts and showing up at McDonald's and all of that. Democrats go into the traditional channels. Now, Harris did her fair share of sitting down for podcasts. I mean, nothing to me said gender gap like Kamala Harris going to talk to Brene Brown and Trump talking to Joe Rogan, right? You're literally not talking to the same people. They're not even on the same planet, those two audiences. But it's really more complex than that. It's like that has to be more than just, this is who I talk to in a campaign, as much as how do we communicate to people who are getting their news and getting their information in all different ways. And actually, most voters aren't people who follow the news. So how do they know what you've done? And that, I think, is going to be the real upheaval for these next few years. Again, Trump is unique because everybody knows Donald Trump. Everybody has an opinion about Donald Trump. He was in the media consciousness for so long. So some Republican after him isn't going to be able to have that access that he did. But understanding and appreciating the ways that we communicate, I think, becomes even more important.
Before we turn to open up for questions, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the congressional elections.
Yay! Because this is your expertise. This is where I started. I love the House. I'm a homer for congressional elections. Ask me anything about congressional campaigns from the 90s. Big fan. Early 2000s. We can go deep.
Well,
Okay, we'll do that.
we'll keep it on 2024 level.
All right.
In the end, the presidential election turned out not to be all that close, but the battle for the House and the Senate was much closer. Why did Democrats perform much better in the congressional races than they did in the presidential race? And does this signal any return to split ticket voting like you were accustomed to seeing when you were studying congressional elections?
That's right, back in the 90s. So I would love to say that, yes, this is a sign that people are more willing to split their tickets now. But actually where we really are is in a place, especially if we look at the House, I was just going back and forth with folks on my team before I got here about how many districts are going to be split ticket districts. And I think maybe we'll get to 20, but it might be 16, something like that. So just imagine that there's 16 out of 435 districts in this country that voted for, and they're mostly going to be Democratic Trump districts, right? So they voted for Donald Trump, but also voted for a Democrat for the House. 16. That's it. In the Senate, we now have 3 states that have a bipartisan delegation, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, down from 6. So that's the lowest number, at least at any time that I know of split ticket voting. I think what happened, and this makes me happy as a practitioner and as somebody who is also in the business of talking about campaigns, is that campaigns matter and candidates matter. And now in a wave election, they don't matter as much, but when you get elections that are constantly fought on the margins, then the quality of the candidate and their ability to campaign becomes critically important. And so I do think that is the piece of it, more so than people, being more willing to give a benefit of the doubt to one party or the other. I do think, though, that, the fact that we had an election where in the national vote shifted about, well, let's say it's 5 or so, maybe 6 points to the right. Again, back in the old days of the 80s or 90s, a 6-point shift to the right would mean that Democrats would probably lose a lot of congressional districts because they would be sitting in seats that were, barely Democratic, or maybe were a little bit Republican that now got super Republican. But instead, most districts are 6, 8, 10 points D or R. So unless there's a huge shift, like a 10-point shift in the electorate or in the environment, most incumbents are going to be okay. And that is not a great thing, because what it says is structurally, there are fewer and fewer moderates, fewer and fewer people who are going to be representing areas that don't look exactly like, they're not as homogenous. And so we still have a Republican and a Democratic caucus in Washington that represents basically incredibly homogenous districts. There's just very little diversity within their ranks in terms of the kinds of people that they represent and the kinds of areas of the country they represent.
And with respect to Democrats waging a strong campaign, what is the role of money in politics in this cycle? What I've been seeing is that Democrats outspent Republicans in most congressional races.
Yes.
And do you see that as having been important for
Absolutely.
Democrats' better performance in the congressional race?
There's no doubt that money made it was really key. And I think that was especially true in the Senate races where you have incumbents, and incumbents come not just with a better name recognition, but they come with a built-in fundraising base that a challenger doesn't have. Though Republicans tried to solve for that this year by just saying, you know what, you know how we can solve for our fundraising problems? Just make sure we get really rich people as our candidates and make sure they write really big checks. Where Democrats do better is they do have, I think, on the donor front, a more robust, smaller donor type of, I guess, ecosystem. And Republicans have the bigger super PAC, the big billionaires who can run their own outside groups. Now, sometimes those outside groups, they're enough that they come in and they spend enough, and it can make a difference, especially in a House race where the money differential is really much more important than, say, a statewide or a presidential race where both sides are pretty equally funded. But I do think even when a candidate is well funded, if the environment is bad or the candidate is bad, you just can't make up for that. But there's no doubt that Democrats' money advantages at the House level and also at the Senate level were a part of that. When I talk about being a good campaigner, having a well-financed campaign is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it too soon to ask about the midterm elections?
Never. We're already deep into 2026. Come on, everybody. Let's go.
I mean, after all, one of the most reliable patterns in American politics is for the party of the president to lose seats in Congress at the midterm.
Yes.
And with Republicans' majority no larger than it currently is in the next Congress, you'd have to say that the House is very much in play in 2026.
For sure.
I'd like to get your sense of the Senate landscape. That's less favorable to Democrats, but it never hurts to be advantaged at a midterm.
Yeah. I mean, the what we're talking about is going to be really important. And by what we're talking about, I mean, what are we going to be talking about in 2026? Are we going to be talking about mass deportation and the impact of that? Are we going to be talking about tariffs that have been implemented and what that has, the impact that has had? Are we going to be talking about the Middle East and something getting worse, better? Are we talking about Ukraine? What are we talking about? That matters a whole lot, number one. The second, with regards to the map, the problem for the Senate in terms of, trying to, whether you have an advantage or not in the Senate, is that, only a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. So you don't get your opportunity to put all of those Senate seats up at once and pick off the weakest ones. Democrats would need to win 4 seats, right? And in order to get into the majority, their best opportunities would be Maine, where Susan Collins is up next year. Now, she said she's running for re-election. I'll take her at her word. But if she does run, I think she's very difficult to beat. But again, if the environment is really, really bad and she has to vote on nominees and programs and all of these things, how is she going to position herself will be fascinating. But again, that's one seat. And then you have North Carolina. Tom Tillis is up this year in North Carolina. That is a purplish, reddish state. And Democrats keep coming close, but not quite getting there in North Carolina. And then Democrats have to defend Georgia, where John Ossoff is up. Pretty likely that the governor of Georgia will want to run, Brian Kemp. That will be a tough seat for Democrats to hold. So you look at that and you say, I don't really see how you get net 4 seats. But in the House, could that flip? Absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably the going bet right now. That would be the going bet.
All right, well, let's open it up for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And you have given us all of what I've who voted for one or the other. What struck me was that 10 million fewer people voted for Kamala Harris than voted for Biden. Trump only got 250,000 more votes than he did the last time, which means that 10 million people sat on their hands.
Well,
And
I don't know if that's right. I haven't looked at, so we've been updating, the popular vote, because remember, we're still, especially in places, it's not just California, but a lot of places are still counting their ballots. I think at the end of the day, when I look at especially those battleground states, what you notice is, yes, Harris's number is lower than Biden's, but Trump's is bigger than it was, significantly bigger than it was in 2020. And so, look, I think that there were a lot of Democrats, or maybe we'll say this, people who showed up for Biden in 2020 that didn't show up this time? Absolutely. Because we know that in a place like California or Colorado, where turnout went down, it didn't result in more votes, say, for Donald Trump. But I also think Democrats will do themselves a disservice if they make this an election where they say this was really because we didn't turn out our voters and Trump turned out his. There are going to be a lot of people who showed up in this election who either have never voted before, right? They didn't vote or they didn't vote in 2020. And there are going to be people who crossed over, who voted for Biden last time, but this time voted for Trump, especially in some of these places like Arizona, Nevada. The final thing I'll say about this, and this is the most frustrating time of the year for me in some ways, because I've waited a year to open all of my presents under the tree, okay? All of my presents were the states and how they're gonna vote, and I've been shaking them all year like, is Pennsylvania? What is it? Where is it gonna be? Now I opened it and I have some things. I've got the raw vote totals and I can compare them to 4 years ago, but I don't really know who voted until they update the voter files and the people who go and do the work that I don't know how to do, but they are able to model out the electorate based on the voter files, verify voters. Pew does a great job of this, can tell us who actually showed up and who didn't. Right now, what we're doing is we're sort of guessing, and we can make some inferences based on the total number of votes. But I am going to wait, and it's hard because we have to wait a long time, like till the spring, before we really know, at least to a better degree, who showed up, and most important, who are they? Like, were they new voters? Were they Biden voters? Were they people who had always voted?
I offered 17-year-old one alternative explanation. maybe the Democrats were just boring. Donald Trump clearly was not boring. Therefore, those that get all of their news from social media voted for the one that wasn't boring.
There you go.
Thank you. We're going to encourage our students to ask questions as well. Any of our students?
I see someone,
All
I
right.
see these two.
And then we'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm a senior in the SPO, so thank you so much. I like watching you on PBS.
Oh my
I
gosh.
kind of have a two-part.
Wow, I love, so he's watching news. There you go.
I don't think I'm your average 21-year-old male.
That's right.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of have two questions for you. This is kind of like the question I think a lot of people who are interested in politics have. This is 3 presidential cycles in a row where polls are overestimating the Republican and overestimating the Democrat, underestimating the Republican. We talked about it so much in 2016, like you said.
Yeah.
But polls 3 times in a row get it wrong. Is this because you believe Donald Trump is such a unique political figure and that this is not going to be the case going forward? And what does this mean for us moving forward? I know this is what we all talk about so much.
Yeah.
Just a really quick second part to this. You spoke earlier about how the Republican Party is sort of becoming the working class. Democrats are becoming establishment. I kind of just want to maybe not push back on that, but just get to the idea that Donald Trump is still extremely wealthy. He was an incumbent. He went to a similar institution. He went to Penn. His vice president went to Yale. He's standing on stage with the wealthiest man in America. And policy-wise, I think that Donald Trump still, his agenda is very clear. His Republican agenda is corporate tax cuts, anti-labor. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has been very pro-labor. Like you said, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Working class. So why do you say that when the
Yeah.
Republicans are still extremely, this is my subjective political opinion, but extremely campaigning and giving their political agenda towards the upper echelon of society? Just to add to that, you mentioned earlier that voters are really smart and they can see through lies and they know when they're being duped. That kind of ties into the second part. If if the rich people, Donald Trump still caters to the upper echelon, people maybe don't see that. And, Donald Trump lies a lot. And you said that voters can see through lies, but how come that doesn't come through?
Yeah.
Sorry for all
Yeah. No. These are all great questions. So let me get the second part very quickly. It kind of comes to the issue of who does Donald Trump surround himself with? Yes, they are people who are really wealthy, but they're coming from a part of our society that is disruptive, right? Elon Musk and the tech guys who are in the sort of sphere of Donald Trump, their appeal, I think, is that they didn't come up through the normal channels, that they are trying to break stuff, that he's challenging NASA, right? Like this is, I was talking to somebody on the Democratic side who was working for somebody on the Democratic side who was trying to find a good surrogate to talk to Latino voters, so who could talk to the Democratic message. And, they went through the list of names, Bad Bunny, all of these big celebrity names. You know who the most popular person was and why you saw him a lot on the campaign trail? Mark Cuban. Why? Because Mark Cuban is an entrepreneur, right? A business guy, a hustler guy, Shark Tank, right? These are regular people who are like, I have this crazy idea. I'm going to make a belt buckle that's also a wallet. Would you like to buy it? Right? Crypto. What is crypto? Again, it's another thing. You don't need to have a degree from Princeton to buy crypto. I can be a multi-billionaire because I figured out how to do this. So you got to take the policy piece of, right, like, well, wait a minute. If you're a person who works in a labor union, what are you doing supporting a guy who wants to do less for labor unions? right, but maybe I don't identify myself first as a labor union member. I identify myself as this. In the same way, I was always surprised during the 2020 campaign to see, here was Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. We got to break up big tech, and tech is terrible, and we're going to go after them. And half the people in the audience worked at Google, right? What? The wealthiest people in the country are voting for Democrats who are actively saying they're going to raise your taxes. Why are they voting for people who are going to raise their taxes? Because there's something more important that they think Democrats are going to provide to them, whether that is a policy but more importantly, I think it's a way of governing and a way of seeing the world. So that's that. The polls, you're right. There is something about Donald Trump that the polls cannot capture all of his vote. Now, the polls got a lot closer this time. I think the polls were very accurate in giving us a roadmap for exactly how this election turned out, especially seeing the challenges that Harris had, keeping that Biden coalition together. We've also seen that the polls have been really good when Donald Trump is not on the ballot. Even though everybody said, 2022, it was all wrong, the polls, it actually wasn't. What the polls showed was that it was really close. And what people were assuming, including me, was that the polls at the end were very close, but at the end of the day, what was going to break? It was going to break against the incumbent party because traditionally, an unpopular incumbent party in a midterm year, they lose. But the polls weren't the problem. So I think the polls have done, given all of the challenges we have in trying to capture the views of a really diverse country, I think they've done okay. Hi.
Thank you again for joining us here today and for joining our domestic politics class earlier. You talked earlier about the Nikki Haley, Liz Cheney type of conservative voter that the Democrats tried to somewhat successfully mobilize to vote for Kamala Harris this election cycle. While obviously this voting bloc was not large enough to bring Harris her victory, they seem important enough still because they stand as possibly the best alternative for Republicans to MAGA republicanism.
Right.
And there's a huge infrastructure also to support this neoconservative brand of republicanism. There's big donors, think tanks, vestiges of political dynasties. I'm wondering what you think happens to these voters after the 2024 election. Do they fade into oblivion? Does the Democratic Party try to motivate them again at the risk of further isolating their progressive wing? What do you think?
Yeah, good
to
question.
them?
So this is about that sort of Liz Cheney, Nikki Haley voter. There was a debate throughout the 2024 primaries about who Nikki Haley voters were. And it was always hard to know because, again, in some primaries, like in New Hampshire, anybody can vote. So you could be an independent, but you're really a Democrat, and then you can go vote in the Republican primary. But in Pennsylvania, it was a closed primary. You have to be registered as a Republican to vote in a primary. And remember, she got a significant number of votes, not just in a closed primary, but after she dropped out, right? Like people are still voting for her. My assumption then, and it is, I think it holds somewhat true from the results, is that those people had already left the party. They didn't need to convince them to leave the party. They were already gone. So those people, they're still registered as Republicans because especially if you live in a town where your local elected officials are all Republican, the only way you're going to have a voice is to vote in a primary. So you stay registered, but that doesn't mean you're really a Republican. And I think they've pretty much left the party. I don't think they're coming back in the same way that conservative white Southern Democrats aren't coming back either. Those folks are gone, and they are now called Republicans. The one place Harris did better, she did not improve on Biden's margin among any demographic group but for one, and that was white college women, college-educated women. So in that sense, she may have picked up some of those, right? Improving by 8 points. Clearly, there were either they're Nikki Haley, Liz Cheney, whatever voter. So it did have an impact, but that 8-point improvement wasn't enough to offset the losses from other groups.
We have time for one last question.
Hi, my name's Gabrielle. I'm a freshman. I had a question just about messaging,
Yeah.
because I think for me, I was expecting there to be a lot more focus on messages like abortion, and then it really just ended up not being as important of an issue as we all predicted it to be. So in terms of messaging for the Democratic Party going forward, should we focus more on one specific message or changing how we do that messaging? Because I know a lot of my peers get most of their news from Instagram, for example.
Or
So
TikTok.
should we, focus more on getting the message right, or just change how we communicate in general?
Great question. I think the seminal rule of politics is always to meet voters where they are, not where you would like them to be. And that means both in the issues, the messaging, but also where they literally are. Like if they're on TikTok, you need to go to TikTok instead of saying, well, that's just I can't believe people aren't getting their information from this, right? Okay, but they are. So you can mock it, or you can say these people aren't serious. How could you be getting your news from the same place that you learn how to do these dances? But it's where you get it from. So they need to go into those places. But I think part of the reason that abortion was not as salient for Trump goes back to for the presidential, goes back to Trump himself. And I do think it worked at the congressional level in a way that it didn't at the presidential level. Donald Trump is not affiliated with that issue in the same way that, say, Mike Pence would be, or that Ron DeSantis, who signed a 6-week ban, would be, right? You could very easily say to people, come on, he wanted a national ban, he's going to have a national ban. People would be like, yeah, that's probably true. With Trump, remember, he's been all over the map on the issue. He was pro-choice, then he was didn't he call himself severely pro-life or something like that? One of the poll questions that always, I know I said voters are smart, they are smart in that they can see things. That doesn't always mean that they're following policy in a way that you would think it's smart, because a lot of people did think that because Roe v. Wade went down during the Biden era, that it was Biden's fault, right? And not really appreciating, like, so there's this thing, it's called the Supreme Court, and there are these people, and then they do this, and but that's a hard thing to walk people through. It's a lot easier if, and this is why Democrats were successful in 2022 and some races this year, you have this candidate that people don't really know that much about. It's like, hi, I'm Republican so-and-so. And then there are ads running over and over again with this Republican saying, there should be no exceptions, or I think all abortion should be banned, right? People go, oh, okay, I get that. This person, that's not my view. You couldn't really do that they tried with Donald Trump, but I think it was just, people believed it, but they didn't see that as much of a immediate threat. But it is kind of the same thing we saw in Texas or in Georgia, where governors there passed those restrictive laws and won re-election, even though a majority of people in those states don't like it. And it goes back to that original question of, how do people decide? This is the most fascinating part, I think, of politics, is the cognitive dissonance part of politics, the human piece of politics. This is why politics is so much more interesting than whatever AI or predictive models can tell you, because it ultimately comes down to humans, and humans are weird. Humans are contradictory. Humans are not always predictable. Because you say, whoa, 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 you told me abortion was your number one issue, but then you're voting for Trump. But how, what, right? People can have to make that binary choice. And so figuring out how they're doing that is really important. So the salience of the issue in their lives at that moment, right? Where they have to say, what is more important at this exact moment right now? We heard in 2022 a lot of women saying, the economy is really important to me, but what's more important is access to reproductive health. So I'm going to prioritize that over the economy. Here you had a lot of voters saying, both are important to me, but I'm going to prioritize. Now, in a state like Arizona, voters were able to do both things. They could vote for Donald Trump, and they could vote for a ballot initiative that enshrined abortion access. Same with Florida, although it didn't pass. But 57% agreed with that. So Donald Trump's getting, what, 55% of the vote? And 57% of people in that state are voting for expanded access to abortion care. Humans. Sorry. Yeah.